worship the Lord, worship in spirit and truth. Those who say that they know Him must walk as He walked. Those who worship the Lord, worship in spirit and truth. Those who say that they know Him must walk as He walked. He is the way and the truth, and in Him is the life. If we obey His word, then we walk in the light. He is the way and the truth, and in Him is the life. If we obey His word, then we walk in the light. If we say that we know Him, but we don't keep His word, then we walk in the darkness, and the truth's not in us. If we walk in the light, we will have fellowship sweet, and the blood of Jesus will cleanse us from sin.
Well, good morning, folks. I'm going to fade the music and get us into our morning here. And I want to first just acknowledge and apologize if you missed us last week. On Friday, I think it was Friday, we realized that the broadcast settings had changed, and I was broadcasting in on a completely different page, and we didn't discover that until partway through the broadcast. So I didn't want to stop where we were for the folks that we had, but what that meant was that we weren't showing up here on the Daily Discipleship podcast page. So we were here. You can go back and listen to last week's, if you haven't done so already, in this, what we're calling 50 days. I should probably say 100 days in the life of Christ, because it's probably more like what it's going to be. Because there's just so much to consider, and we have 30 minutes of time each day, and so many different passages of Scripture to consider, and lots of things to discuss and talk about in the life of Christ. I mean, we are just trying to sit with Jesus and be with Jesus. Remember Mary and Martha? The story of Jesus had come to visit, and Martha was running about the house trying to get things ready, and Mary had chosen just to sit and listen to her rabbi teach, and Martha became somewhat indignant about Mary not helping, and Jesus said to Martha that Mary had chosen the far better thing, and that was to sit at the feet of Jesus. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to sit at His feet. We're trying to take in from His life and learn from Him as much as we can learn. In fact, as much as we can learn on this pass, because there's so much more that we can learn and need to learn and want to learn about the life of Christ. And that's why we are just camping out in His life here. Now, last week, we left off talking about Jesus and the visit of the Magi. We talked about how the often our nativity scenes are factually incorrect. And I said, look, I don't have a problem. I get why we put the wise men and the shepherds all around Jesus at what looks like a barn structure. I get why we do that. And it's okay. It's not something that we have to, have a deep conviction and wipe out the wise men or something like that. But factually, there was likely, and we talked about this last week, there was likely up to a 2-year difference between when the shepherds visited the cave or the barn, whatever the structure was where Jesus was born. Some believe it was a cave, and if you go to Jerusalem, it seems like it's a cave. I say Jerusalem, go to Israel, Bethlehem, which is outside of Jerusalem, And so it may very well have been a cave where they kept the animals and where Jesus was born. That's where the shepherds came, but the text told us that when the wise men came, they came to the house where he was staying. So that tells us that that Jesus had moved on and his family had moved on from the cave or living in a house. And still, for whatever reason, within a few years, in the vicinity of Bethlehem. And so the wise men came, they presented gifts. And this is a little bit of recap from last week. And to think about the gifts, the very next thing that would happen that we read from Matthew chapter 2:13 is that an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said to him, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and escape to Egypt." We read that in Matthew 2:13. Now, Matthew 2:19 tells us Jesus returned from Egypt when Herod died. We don't know all the reasons why the Lord had Jesus and his family go to Egypt. We don't know. We just know that that is where they escaped to. And that was a fulfillment of prophecy. And we will get into some of that today as we dig into the study. And you remember where Jerusalem was and where Bethlehem was. Here it is on the map again. Sea of Galilee to the north, the Jordan River running from the Sea of Galilee down south to the Dead Sea. Here you see Hebron and then Bethlehem and Jerusalem right over here to the, for those listening via audio, it would be to the west of the Dead Sea, about a quarter to a third of the way. Yeah, maybe let's say a third of the way toward the Mediterranean Sea. So Mediterranean Sea to the west of Jerusalem and Bethlehem, Dead Sea to the east. And so that's where Jesus had been, but then they take off and go to Egypt as the angel of the Lord had instructed them to do. Last week we looked at some readings. We're going to go back and just cover these just a little bit because I want to ask a few questions out of this. Out of Luke chapter 2, verses 39 through 52. We'll take a little look here and read those passages. Luke 2. Okay, and down at verse 39. We read this. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their town of Nazareth. As the child grew and became strong, he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And now we pick up on with Jesus at the temple. So now he is in this pre-adolescent stage, and this is what we were talking about last week, Jesus in pre-adolescence, adolescence. Verse 41 says, every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the feast according to the custom. And again, some of this is recap from last week. I understand that. After the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, now remember, there was a whole entourage of people. It wasn't like just them in their in their cart with a donkey and just them. There were thousands of people who would come to Jerusalem for the feast. So after the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled for a day. They began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. And after 3 days, they found him in the temple court, sitting among the teachers, listening to them. Now, and this is key, and asking questions. Now, I want to talk about questions for just a moment, then we'll come back into the passage here. One of the foremost teachers that we have, all of us have the same teacher, should we choose to employ said teacher, and said teacher's name is Question. Teacher Question. So, Rabbi Question, we can be taught by questions, by the inquisitive mind, by asking questions we learn. And so here we see Jesus there asking all kinds of questions. Luke 2, verse 46, sitting among the teachers, he's listening to them and asking them questions. It says this: everyone that heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." He says, "Why were you searching for me?" He asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" Now, think about how that may have stung for Joseph. Joseph knew full well that God the Father was the true father of Jesus. But to think about this thing, I had to be in my father's house. He's not saying I need to be at Joseph's house. I need to be in God, my father's house. He's busy about the business. He's busy beginning to ask questions. He's busy being instructed by these leaders in the temple around Jerusalem, around the synagogues, around Jerusalem, asking them questions. It says they did not understand what he was saying to them when he said, "Didn't you know I need to be in my father's house?" Then he went down to Jerusalem, to Nazareth with them, and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. Now, Jesus did not sin. It wasn't like Mary and Joseph said, "Come on, Jesus, it's time to go now." And he said, "No, I'm staying here." He hadn't rebelled against his parents, because we're told in the book of Hebrews that Jesus never sinned. Had his parents said, "Jesus, it's time to go," and he refused them and was disobedient to them, that would have been sin. Jesus never sinned. They were with their friends. Jesus was probably with the children his own age. They were playing. They were doing things around the city of Jerusalem. And the entourage just assumed that when they left, their kids left with them. In this case, Jesus didn't leave. I want to clarify the fact that it wasn't that they said, "Come on, Jesus, it's time to go home." And he said, no. It's a case that they just were unaware. I mean, I've heard stories about people being left behind, in stories of, I think, two ladies named Candy and Daleen, if I remember correctly, left behind one time. Was it Daleen? Candy and somebody left behind on a road trip one time over, I think it was in New Hampshire. And I think they might have been teenagers. I don't recall who, but I'm pretty sure Candy was one of them. And so we have Jesus left behind. I mean, in the case of Candy, I mean, they're in one car. It's easy to count how many kids are back there, but the assumption is, we just a bunch of kids back there. Okay, let's go. So you can see how traveling with a whole entourage of people, Jesus could have been left behind. But I want to underscore the fact that Jesus was not in disobedience to his parents. They just didn't know where he was. They weren't keeping track of him. He was, coming up to the age where he would be considered a young adult. Adolescence in that era was a time when young men were considered young adults. Unlike today, we have to be in their 20s, but 12, 13, bar mitzvah time, coming into that age, coming into the teenage years, they were viewed to be responsible and adults. So Jesus was close to that age, most likely, and I think the text said he was 12. So we know that much about Jesus, and so they just assumed he's just fine. Now, we can ask the question out of this: in what areas did Jesus grow as a human being? It says he grew in wisdom and stature. Tells us that in the text. So stature could be talking about his physical stature. It could also just mean the stature of his character. Both. He grew in wisdom. He grew in wisdom by asking questions. He grew in wisdom by observation. he grew in wisdom because he was being instructed by his parents. All of these things are true. So when we come to this idea of the question and answer with the religious leaders, I mean, the question might be, what was Jesus doing? Now, Walter asked the question over in the comments. Do you think he didn't know the answer to those questions, or was he asking to see what their answers would be? Yes, that's my answer. That's the safe answer, just to say yes. I do think most likely he knew the answer. Could it be that he was asking the questions to cause, as you were saying, causing the religious leaders to think about? Now, I'm going to get us into a little bit of the dialogue that he may have been having with those religious leaders. So let me get into some of those questions and some of the background of the text. And think about what some of the wrestling that may have been going on in a 12-year-old boy's life at this point in time. Now, also think about the experiences that he has had. He had the experiences in Nazareth as a young child, had the experience as a boy living in Egypt, perhaps up till the age of 8. So he's had a multicultural experience at this point in time. Now, it's likely that people around Nazareth knew about Mary and Joseph's situation. They knew about the quick marriage, which everybody assumes there was a pregnancy, so they got married. You got to get married type of answer, which, for the record, I don't think is necessarily always the right answer. Oftentimes it's not. A mistake was made, a sin was committed, if you want to say that. And so oftentimes parents will say, well, you got to do the right thing, son. You need to marry her. Well, there's been a lot of carnage out of that. Now, maybe from a strictly moral vantage point, that is a right conclusion to that situation. But as a pastoral counselor, I've seen and heard about a lot of carnage in a decision like that, unless there is intentional discipleship of that young woman and that young man, and the young man and the young woman are open to being challenged and to growing. Often there is carnage. Now, let's think about this. Let's think about Jesus and what's taking place. I want to get into what could have been a conversation. Think of Jesus as he's getting older. Think of the questions that he is asking. Jesus continues education. He's in the synagogue. In Nazareth, he's under the watchful eye of a religious leader, if not plural religious leaders. And as he's getting older, he begins to hunt for the answers to tough questions like, why do I not have any of the characteristics of my father Joseph and only those of my mother Mary? Now, again, this is speaking from the human vantage point. He might ask the question, why do I not have my grandfather's name or my father's name? As oftentimes they would get the name of their parent. Where did the name Jesus come from? Or maybe, why do the Messiah and I have so much in common? Now, did he lay aside all of his foreknowledge to grow in humanity, to grow in human wisdom? Some think that he even laid aside that aspects that didn't tap into the foreknowledge of his omniscience so that he could have the full experience as a child. And there's a lot that comes into play with that theologically. As an example, if Jesus was living in his deity while he was in human form, he could have never sinned. Now, there's major debate between scholars about could Jesus have ever sinned, or some would say he never could have sinned. It was impossible that he could sin, and yet people would come back on the other side and say, well, if he could never have sinned, then what was the point of the temptation? If you can't sin, then there really is no temptation. The fact is, while scholars debate that, Jesus did not sin, and we don't understand, and this is one of the mysteries that I don't think we can solve. Some people want to solve it. I can't solve it. I don't want to pretend to be able to solve the mystery that Jesus was fully God and fully man. I don't want to pretend to understand the mystery of what it may have been like for Jesus as a boy, but we see him asking questions. We see him growing in wisdom and stature in his humanity. So there's an aspect of a laying aside that I believe that he laid aside certain aspects of his deity. He didn't tap into them. They were there, but he didn't tap into them that he may have the human experience. There's much to think about in that. Now, again, during this pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the celebrating the Passover with family and friends, Jesus was now 12. He could ask questions and interact with the religious leaders of the day. So apparently, prior to that time, prior to the age of 12, he couldn't ask those questions. So again, in Luke 2:46, we read this: after 3 days, they found him in the temple court, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And it makes you wonder, what were they talking about? What kinds of questions was Jesus asking them? What were their responses? Wouldn't it be something to have just been able to be there to observe, just as a listener, and to think about Jesus as a 12-year-old putting the pieces together? Now my friend Mark Edwards, who put together this study initially, suggests a conversation that may have been something like this. Jesus saying to the leaders, "Is it true that Messiah will be born in Bethlehem of Judah?" One of the teachers says, "Yes, of course, young lad. All good Jews know that it is written in Micah 5:2, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will rule over Israel." Now, Jesus knew where he was born. His parents had raised him for the first couple years of his life there. So he knows this, the Jewish leaders, and perhaps he's asking the questions, trying to get them to think, or preparing them for what will happen in about 20 years, or a little less than 20 years, 28 years, as he begins to reveal himself to the people of Israel. But then the conversation continues. Jesus says, "Isn't it also true that the Messiah will come forth out of Egypt?" Because that was also true. Now, one of the teachers may have said, "Silly boy, we just told you that he would come forth out of Bethlehem. How could he come out of two places?" And yet, there's a plurality of teachers, a plurality of priests. So an old priest from the back perhaps says, "Now hold on a minute. I believe the boy has a legitimate question. Yes, I believe it's true. Look right here. It's written in Hosea 11:1. Out of Egypt I called my son." And so people sit there in astonishment. Again, Mark, just trying to imagine what Jesus may have said, says this: "So what if the Messiah was born in Bethlehem, then for some strange reason his family had to move for Egypt for a time, and then they returned? Could it be a possible explanation for the two scriptures to be both true in that way?" And all are amazed hearing this come from Jesus. "Yes, I know I was born in Bethlehem, and then my family moved to Egypt for a while." Just think of the conversation and what could have been taking place between Jesus and those teachers of the law. Now, it said this in Luke 2:47, "Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers." We read that already. Have you been amazed by Jesus? One of the things that's amazing about Jesus' life that it says in two verses, both one in Luke 2:40 and the other one in Luke 2:52, "As the child grew and became strong, he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men." I mean, people were liking him at this point in time. Jesus was growing in every area of life, just like we do. To those around him, like his family and these elders and teachers, he looked and sounded just like a normal boy. Why? Because he was fully human. God had become like us. Luke is recording this. He's asked questions. These are eyewitness accounts. And he's asking people who were there, probably even asked Mary, the mother of Jesus. Think about the family here, to think about what it would have been like to have been Jesus' younger brother or sister, because he was the firstborn. What it would have been like to be sisters or brothers, and we know that he had them. To ask the question, when did Jesus come to the realization that Joseph was not his real father? Since by the age 12, he was referring to the temple as his father's house. Think about teenage years. What temptations might have Jesus gone through as a teen? Since we know that he was tempted in every way yet as we were tempted. Do you think when Jesus was missing that Mary was frantic, or was she confident of the Father in heaven taking care of Jesus? What went through her mind as he was missing? Then to think about some Old Testament passages that we're not going to dig into this morning, like things that we read in Isaiah 11, 1 through 5 that we've read, or Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, or Micah 5, 2. Jesus as a boy, Jesus in his pre-adolescence. And really, this is all we know about Jesus up until the time that we see him again around the age of 30. Which is what we'll pick up on tomorrow. Well, friends, it is the end of the time. It's the end of the broadcast, and I am going to get you into your day today, and we will think about what it means to be like Jesus. We will think about all the temptations that Jesus faced even in his youth. Now, some of us, most of us, many of us are older. What about the temptations that we face in our life? Still, temptations of discouragement, the temptations of comparison, the temptations of despair, temptations even of lust or covetousness, or the temptations of allowing our anger to cause us to do some sinful thing. In all of that, Jesus, tempted as we were, yet without sin, relates with us and can provide us his strength. Lord, help us today to live for you. Help us today to walk with you. Help us to contemplate the life of our Lord Jesus and to love him and to draw close to him. That by abiding in him, we may bear much fruit. Lord, help us today to bear fruit for your honor and glory in Jesus' name. Amen. Friends, have a great day. See you.